This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Joey Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solar punk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Hello, I am Jessie Gender, so most people would probably know me from my YouTube channel where I do sort of video essay type of things, kind of either talking about LGBTQ issues, trans issues, and politics, and then the other hand, nerddoms, geekdoms, fandoms, and things like that. And I also tackle within that also like autism and neurodiversity issues because I am also on the autism spectrum. And then my best videos are the ones that combine all of those things together and talk about all of them as sort of like a through line and using science fiction as a guide to talk about modern stuff. Beyond that, I also, like I said, I work as a trans and advocate and LGBTQ advocate and things like that, and work as a journalist as well. So that's mostly me.
The video on Star Trek and autism is definitely my favorite one. And so I'll give some kind of background because this episode is going to come out in January, and it's going to be the fourth episode, I think, in January. And the 3 episodes before that one are all going to be on solar punk. And so,
okay, very cool.
Yeah. So this is the fourth one. So obviously there's going to be a theme of futurism and all of that. But it's also the first one so far. I've been doing this for almost 2.5 years or so. That for some folks might sound niche, like you're talking about Star Trek and autism, like that. That's like, not a lot of folks might be both like Trekkies and autistic at the same time. And I don't know whether this is a gamble. Like, I don't know whether fewer folks will listen to this just because they say, well, I'm not autistic or I'm not a Trekkie. Or maybe this is too niche, or maybe this is, what have you. But we'll see how it goes. Give us, if it's okay with you, like some kind of general picture of like your journey through Star Trek. Like how did that start for you? I'm sure you've told that story a bunch of times, but for our listeners, that's probably the first time.
Yeah, of course. So it's I always say that I got into Star Trek in like the weirdest possible way. Like no one yet has beaten my story, which at least in terms of like entry point. So my way of getting into Star Trek was my dad and my mother were divorced. So on weekends, my dad would drive me to his place. We'd have like an hour or so. And he would always play some audiobooks or something like that. And so one day he put on a Star Trek audiobook for the movie Star Trek Nemesis. So it was the audiobook for the movie. And if you're a Trekkie, you know that that's a weird place to have started at because, number one, it's the last of the Next Generation movies. So it's like the last of all of them. And also it's considered to be one of the worst Star Trek movies in general. So I got into Star Trek by the audiobook of the last Star Trek The Next Generation movie, which is also one of the worst, in my personal least favorite Star Trek movie. But I loved that audiobook to death. And like stole it from my dad. It was technically a library one, I think, but I just like took it and just used it for forever. And kept listening to it. And then my dad bought me the DVDs, and then I watched Star Trek Enterprise on TV. Which was the last Star Trek show of that sort of era, like early 2000s was when it was ending. Kind of came out right during and right after 9/11. Kind of addressed some of those things, and it was sort of the show where Star Trek was on the wane, and it actually was the first one to be canceled since the original series. So it was just a weird time to have gotten into Star Trek. But what I started to do as a Trekkie is I just really, what I would describe it now as like hyperfixating on it and just became obsessed with it. So to the point where like I just kept buying books, I watched all the shows, it was just became like this very central thing. in my life, to the point where like I still refer to it. I mean, obviously I'm still talking about it today and still doing stuff with it today. But even more deeply, I sort of point to it as like the thing that gives me a lot of my morality and my sort of guide in terms of just how I see the world,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of being hopeful about things even when things are really dark. So yeah, that's sort of the shortened version of my journey with Star Trek.
So, so what you just explained, at least in the last bit, is how I try and explain why I'm a Trekkie and why I love Star Trek. Because to folks who maybe maybe they've checked out one episode, maybe they vaguely know about like Spock or what have you, some of the general themes maybe, it can feel very niche and or at kind of at best like, oh, this is just gonna take so much time to get into.
Mhm.
And there are some like I so I'll explain how I got into it. My story is much more boring, to be honest. Um, Growing up, I had seen some episodes of the original series and of Next Generation that kind of popped up on TV from time to time, but it never really clicked for me. I didn't watch it like chronologically or whatever. And then
Mhm.
just 2 years ago, as COVID started, I think that was around the same time that Discovery came out, or at the very least, that's when I paid attention to Discovery on Netflix. And so I really properly, quote unquote, started Star Trek through Discovery, which I later found out is
Oh.
actually what a lot of folks don't like it. Oh, it's not original or whatever.
I like it, but that's a whole topic for a different
Yeah, yeah,
day.
yeah. No, I'm familiar with it. I've since become familiar with that, like that the entire thing around it. But so yeah, then after that I went to the Next Generation because I was told, and now that I'm watching the original series, I understand that it can be more like it needs a bit more patience. Let's put it that way. Then the Next Generation, and the Next Generation is the one I got completely hooked on the Next Generation, and then I went DS9 and Voyager, and now, as I said, I'm going through the original series,
Oh
and
yeah.
also Discovery. And so I haven't seen Picard, I haven't seen Enterprise, and I haven't seen Lower Deck, I think it's called. I haven't seen those. I haven't seen most of the movies except some of the more recent ones that were like out in the cinemas and stuff. And so
Mhm.
it kind of felt like with the hardcore Trekkies, my story is like not not interesting. It's just like, oh, I found it. It was on Netflix, and oh, this was interesting, and then it clicked, and then after that, yeah, since then, I mean, it's been only
No,
2 years, but
but
it's been an
yeah,
obsession.
I think it's a fine way to get into it. I mean, it's nice to hear. I mean, honestly, a lot of the people that I sort of talk to and like hear about Star Trek is usually people who are like, "Oh yeah, I got into it back in the day,
Mm-hmm.
like in the 2000s and the 90s, something like that." And I hear every once in a while about people who got into it in more recent days, but not as much. Just because of the fact that I'm a big Trekkie nerd, so I usually hang out with people who have been doing it for a long time. So it's really nice to like hear people who got into it fairly recently. Like that's not boring. I think that's cool. It makes me happy that people are like able to find it and able to get into it and able to like just go back and see all the other stuff as well, while also enjoying some of the newer stuff as well. Which, by the
Completely.
way, you should be watching Lower Decks because it's my
I
favorite.
know it is your favorite, and I definitely will watch Lower Deck because it is. Like at this point, after watching that video and I watched that documentary as well. We mentioned like I think on gender roles. Like definitely, I will take your advice into consideration. It's gonna be next on the list. Yeah, like TNG especially, and then as I said the others, but especially TNG at first was the like two of my friends are gonna listen to this. Like shout out to Ibrahim and Lana. We bonded on that. We
Oh,
the friends from back home from Lebanon, but they actually had moved to Geneva, where I'm currently based, like in Switzerland. And I mean, long story short, like I moved and the pandemic started, so like there wasn't that much socialization happening, and they were kind of our safe group. Like we would only see them for quite some time, for a good
mhm.
year, really. We only saw two humans. I mean, we saw him, but like interacted like I mean, folks know what I don't know why I have to explain myself as if folks listening to this have no idea what COVID is or what a pandemic is or whatnot, but I have
You
this
know,
need
when
to
people in
explain
the Star
everything.
Trek future do like find this, and it's like the one relic of like pre World War III, information that'll help. See, they'll know. It's
Exactly.
like, oh,
Yeah,
COVID.
I want to be thorough. I'm just contextualizing for everyone, including someone listening to this in 100 years. But
Well,
yeah, anyway,
it's just. Oh, sorry.
no, 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 it's fine.
It's just funny that you do that, because I realize I do the same thing too quite often, where I contextualize things that people should take as a given. It's why like so many of my videos are like an hour to 2 hours long, is because like I watch other people's videos and I'm always like surprised by like how well they can like just be concise, because my brain, and it goes to what we're kind of talking about with neurodiversity, is just like, oh, I need to explain to you every single piece. I can't like assume that you know anything, and not to like think people are idiots, but just being like, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it's just funny because you and I do pretty much the same thing. It sounds like.
No, we do. Like a small story. Like me and my wife like have this conversation all the time. Like a tiny story that I have in mind. It feels like it's tiny, or at least it feels like it's gonna be short, but it ends up being not short
Mm,
at all, actually.
hmm. I
But
know that feeling.
but let's say someone is listening. Let's say the folks are listening. I hope some folks are listening to this. They don't know much about Star Trek. What is it about it for you that clicks? I mean, maybe not in, I don't know, 20 years ago, but like now, why does it still click? Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So many things that I could say, but I think the guiding thing for me is it is a show that is about the future, but it is one that looks at it with hope, and optimism that humanity will one day sort of stop focusing on our differences, or stop focusing on what separates us and focusing on what draws us together,
Mm-hmm.
And that will allow us to do really beautiful, wonderful things, and be able to explore and just focus on just the mysteries of life and the universe, in a way that allows us all to just better ourselves. And I even have tattooed on my wrist. It has a sort of theme of infinite diversity and infinite combinations, and so I
Mm-hmm.
had it tattooed on my wrist because I just love this idea of, you know, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, who is his own very complex figure,
Yes.
but he did have some great quotes, and one of my favorite quotes of his is like, we need to take delight in the differences of others and the differences of life forms. It's not just tolerating; it's taking delight
Mm-hmm.
in others, and just that idea that, the future of humanity can only be bright if we see each other and say, hey, you're different than me, and that's beautiful and amazing, and we make each other stronger through that. And then kind of along, like, I always make this as a joke, as like a side thing, but it kind of goes along with what I just said, is that like Star Trek is just a very weird and strange franchise. It has some of the, like, these episodes that are really deep, really thoughtful, explore modern topics and politics and social issues through a science fiction lens. And then the very next episode you'll get like Ferengi being weird and just like, oh, we're gonna do like a weird heist thing, or then you'll get an
Mm-hmm.
episode where like Janeway turns into a salamander or whatever. It's just a show that like that is very serious and very important, but then can also be weird and strange and off-putting. And I love that. I love that it's just a series that, in a series that's about diversity, it is itself very diverse in the stories that it tells. And I just really enjoy that. Like, it's like desert island thing. If you could,
Mm-hmm.
like, if I could only pick one thing to be on a desert island with, you know, I would pick Star Trek, not just because I love it, but because it's like I would just get a little bit of everything, and it just reflects the ideas that it's always been about in that, and I love it.
Yeah, one thing I've definitely found is that it really rewards patience. Like as I said, I got into it through Discovery, which in many ways, if you're not used to this slower pace of some of the older Star Trek like series, maybe Discovery is like easier to get in. At least that's how I found. Like it was,
Hmm.
it's like more action filled in many ways, and I know that's part of why some folks don't like it, but whatever. Um, I also know part of why some folks don't like it is racism and transphobia and all of that stuff.
I
So
mean, there's that,
there's
yeah.
that, yes.
I mean, there are
But
legitimate grievances
yeah, yeah,
against
yeah.
Discovery, and I certainly have issues with it here and there, but I also really like it because, as a show, I think it is one of the Star Trek shows that has best embodied the idea of infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Like, I don't think there's a Star Trek show that, like, because one of the problems with older Star Trek shows is they sometimes tend to have a very we'll call it male gaze, but
Yes.
definitely like and that definitely is true. There's definitely a lot of like look at the pretty women sort of thing, but
Mm-hmm.
also like otherizing like queer folks and otherizing other cultures and people. And don't get me wrong, it's still very diverse, and often, not always, but often for the time in which it took place, it was one of the more progressive shows on at the
Mm-hmm.
time. Not always, but generally so.
Yeah.
Um, but that being said, the times in which they were in still had problems, even for the progressive shows. And what I love about Discovery specifically is I think it is one of the best shows ever to really feel like it is not only inclusive of everyone, but not only diverse, but inclusive of everyone, I should say. And like everyone gets to exist as themselves for themselves rather than for like some voyeuristic look at like, oh, let's learn about this culture, let's learn about the gay folks, let's learn about like people
Mm-hmm.
from this culture. But it just allows people to like just take part in it, very the future of humanity, very naturally. And so I really love that show for it. And then other things, like I love the characters and there's some good episodes. I have problems with some of its serialized structure, but that's a story for a different day.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think we would have the same grievances. I was listening to this episode of a podcast called Busy Being Black, and it was with Chanda Prescott Weinstein, who wrote
Mm.
this book called The Disordered Cosmos, and they're all both of them, like the host and the guest, were like are like Trekkies, and they were talking about Star Trek Discovery and how there's one episode. I'll try and minimize spoilers for folks listening, but there's one episode where the captain, who is a black woman and her name's Michael, meets this alien race, and this alien race, they sort of like there's no difference in skin color. You know, they kind of look quote unquote the same, at least as far as color like skin tone goes and whatnot.
Mm.
Um, and so because that's the case, when they meet Michael, as far as they're concerned, like this is what humans look like, right? Like humans look like
Mm.
Michael Burnham. She had her natural hair. She's a black woman, and so on. And they would have no reason, given their reality, to think otherwise. Like this is just how what humans look like. And obviously, I didn't think of it that way. I was listening to the episode just a few days ago. So for those listening, the podcast is called Busy Being Black, and I think it's one of the more recent episodes. You can check that out. It's a pretty good episode, and it's largely about Star Trek, but also about like physics and quantum stuff and whatever. But like it was really interesting. And so
Yeah,
yeah,
that
that.
sounds.
Hmm?
I'll have to check it out because that sounds awesome.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's really good. But like that kind of made me pause, and it reminded me for like the thousandth time in the past 2.5 years why I enjoy Star Trek.
Hmm.
And so this brings me to sort of the not really the main thing, but one of the main things I want to talk about, which is obviously the like autistic, like representation of autism and neurodiversity. I even listed them in case I forget, but there are so many characters in Star Trek, and obviously your YouTube video talks about that, and folks can just, I think if they just write, well, if you write Jessie Gender Star Trek autism, you'll find it on
Yeah,
YouTube.
that'll be there.
Yeah, it should be there. But like, so there is Spock in the original series. There's Data and Barclay in the Next Generation. There's Tilly in Discovery. There's Barclay, I just mentioned that in TNG, and Seven of Nine in Voyager, and Odo in DS9, and I think there's one in Enterprise, but I haven't seen Enterprise. Um,
T'Pol would probably be the most
right,
immediate
right.
person who comes to mind. Yeah, from that show.
So, given that I know that the actor, I'm very bad with names, but I know that the actor for Data mentions, like, there's a video on YouTube where like he was interviewed. He was asked like, that did you know that lots of autistic folks and neurodivergent folks have built this bond with Data? And he said like, yeah, he had heard about this. I mean, he didn't know it while filming, but he had heard about this later on, and then obviously that moved him and whatnot. But not just Data itself, but why do you think there's been that? Like, as far as I know, maybe you know more than I do, but as far as I know, the writers weren't necessarily thinking like that way when they were kind of creating Data or whatnot, or the other characters. Why is there that bond? Because I watched that video and I thought, okay, I'm not the only one,
Mhm.
but clearly other folks also feel that way. Like, I've just been looking on Tumblr and Reddit, and just it's a thing. Why is it a thing?
Well, I mean, for two reasons, I think primarily. The first is that like Star Trek has always been about the other in
Mm-hmm.
some way. I mean, not always specifically, but like it's a show about, like I said, it's about diversity, and there are always characters on each show that feel very othered in some way, shape, or form, like Spock or something like that.
Yeah,
Deep Space
yeah,
Nine is literally a show where everyone's considered
yeah.
another, in some way, shape, or form. And as a result, I think like that element of things really does drop like a lot of people who feel othered by society to the show because they can resonate with those themes of feeling outside. But then also, like, I think there are these characters on the show that that the writers just sort of in both positive and negative ways like drew upon sort of neurodiversity as coding for like how people think that sometimes seems strange but we can be very accepting of.
Right.
Data, for example, he is a an android who sort of has very like just clear ways of looking at the world and just very clear like lines of thought, and is sort of discovering things in a way that like neurodiverse people really I think relate to, because he doesn't sort of like have necessarily a grasp of all the context of like social interactions, but likes to understand them and break them down in a way that is very like, oh, this, then this, then this, then this, then this. That I think just neurodiverse people really, really resonate with. And then you also have people like Odo, who is a character in Deep Space Nine who comes from, without too much of a spoiler, he comes from a shape-shifting species, and so he doesn't understand solids, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And so his sort of like autism is all about like not understanding social situations and how it can isolate you and things like that. And so Odo is also this character who like has to come into a situation and be like, I'm gonna try and understand this from like my own background, and we come from completely different like ways of viewing the world, and so now but I have to fit into a society where I'm the one that feels weird in. And so like having to sort of break it down and understand it in that way. And I think that happens a lot with like aliens and androids that you have in Star Trek, where you're sort of like talking about cultures that are very distinct and different from each other having to interact with each other. And it's not to say that it's every character that's like that, but a lot of them are. And I mean I think that's really, really positive in some senses, in the sense that like I think these representations in Star Trek are the ones that really resonate with people and allow people who do see ourselves in those representations to eschew some of the negative associations with neurodiverse representation by seeing ourselves in these characters, because they didn't come in with like, this character is going to be neurodiverse, so we're going to like do the like savant sort of trope, or
Mm-hmm.
the infant, though there is some infantilization, but so like the infantilization trope sort of thing. But that being said, this goes back to something I said earlier about like the problems with earlier Star Trek, is that sometimes that by doing that, like coding people as androids and aliens, there's a bit of otherization in Star Trek 2 when you look at it as a neurodiverse coding, and then there's still some issues too if we apply the reading of a neurodiverse lens onto these characters. But on the whole, I think like a lot of neurodiverse people draw to it because, well, what a lot of like outsiders do. It's because we the show is able to articulate those things in a way that feels safe and wholesome, rather than sort of very problematic where more literal representations fail.
Yeah, I don't think since then, as I said, I started with Discovery and then TNG, but in TNG the character of Data, and to a lesser extent Barclay as well, actually,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's very odd. I mean, at least it's odd for me to explain it, or I have difficulties explaining, but I don't know how to explain the bond that I felt with a fictional character, because I never really had that with fiction in general, whether it's books or TV or series or what have you. They are like, obviously growing up, like there were characters in Lord of the Rings. That was like the big thing for me growing up, that I was like, oh, this is a, cool male figure or whatever. I had that kind of stuff growing up, like Aragorn or what have you, Gandalf, that sort of thing. But it wasn't like, oh, I identify myself in that character. There wasn't like that sort of link. And with Data, I felt that. I really did. Obviously, as you know, he's an android, so there's quote unquote more extreme, you might put it, or one might put it. But the attempt at understanding something that he doesn't really understand, and also the patience that the folks around him like see that he is genuinely trying to understand, and that there is actually a way of both like understanding one another, like that sort of struggle and tension. And I think it's I'm sure like there are some issues with it, but I found it like pretty well done. And with
Mm-hmm.
Barkley, I don't know. I did feel sometimes it was kind of, maybe this is a bit too much playing on that trope or whatnot, but like nothing. I didn't have like serious issues as I think others did. I
Yeah, I
just
think.
like the character as a person. I just like that person.
Yeah, no, I mean for both of them, I agree with you. Like Data, I think is one people gravitate towards because there's not a lot of stigma associated with his character. Like people just understand and get it.
Hmm.
They're just like, oh, let's figure out a way, and characters are like willing to explain to him as well. They don't like look down on him for not understanding instantaneously, which is something that a lot of neurodiverse people, I think, be it associated with, get feel because like if we
Hmm.
don't immediately understand something, society around us will sort of shame us, and people will like look down upon us because we're seen as like, oh, you don't understand this. This is something that so many people just understand naturally, whereas a lot of us are like, what, that's weird to me, I don't understand what's going on. But with Data, like because he's seen as an android, the characters are like really willing to like be with him, and him being like ask questions and then answer for him because they're like, oh, he doesn't understand, so let's explain and try and figure out a way that makes sense to him, and be empathetic to him as opposed to like trying to put our own standards upon him, which I think is just really kind of wonderful and awesome. And then the character of Barkley. Barkley is a very contentious. Like some people find him very problematic, and I think the reason is, and I think there's numerous things, but the reason is he is a much more kind of stereotypical depiction of autism, and then also, which is a very uh like different for Star Trek, and I think it works. But some people might disagree. Like Star Trek, as I said, is a show about being accepting to people. But Barclay, especially in the first episode, which we meet him, faces a lot of that kind of stigma because he's a character who is very socially anxious,
Hmm.
can't really look people in the eye. He gets very scared around being around people, and focuses really in on his hyperfixations, which in the series is like a holodeck, which is kind of like a video game and movies. It kind of reminds me of my own obsession with Star Trek, right? Like he has his
Hmm.
own obsession
Exactly.
with
Yeah.
holodecks. Um, and he even has like kind of a cruel nickname, and that people sort of have for him. And it's not like overtly making fun, right? Like it's not the intention to be super native, but it is very mean. And and the episode acknowledges that,
Yeah.
which I think is good. But I think people balk at that because like, oh, this is the character who has to experience that when a lot of Star Trek characters don't, and we see it within Starfleet and within the Federation, which is something you don't normally see. You normally see as something outside of that. But I think it works specifically because of what we were talking about earlier, in that like, Starfleet is seen as like the best of the best. Everyone sort of like has this expectation that you're supposed to be at this level when you work in Starfleet. And Barclay definitely is. He's very smart, but because he doesn't fit into the mold of being a very extroverted person and can work with everybody as easily, he is looked down upon because he doesn't fit the necessarily the mold of Starfleet that everyone else looks at.
Hmm.
And I think that that's I don't know. I think it's worth seeing that these prejudices and these problems and stigmas can still exist within the future of humanity. Because one thing that I think people fall into when talking about Star Trek is they talk about it as a utopia, as if it's like
Yeah.
supposed to be a perfect society, and that's something that Gene Roddenberry tried to push when he sort of came back to make the Next Generation and wanted to like leave it as his legacy rather than like telling good stories. Um, but I really actually prefer looking at Star Trek as a show that is just a future where humanity is better and working, and it's focused on it being better, but isn't always um perfect. There's a line that Data even says is like, we must strive to be more than we are.
Mm.
Will not reach our ultimate goal, but the effort yields its own rewards. And I love that as like a guiding light for looking at Star Trek. So if you look at Barclay, I think that those things exist, and I like seeing that those problems still exist in the future. We work through them to the point where, as we see Barclay grow throughout the Next Generation and Voyager, he becomes like much more accepted. Like he is able to better work out his social anxiety and better able to like articulate himself and work within these situations. But people also come to understand his own proclivities and his own uniqueness as well. So it's a little bit of like both. And I think that arc is really wonderful and important, in a way that like I think a lot of people focus on the start of that arc, and understandably so. But I think his arc is really a great one.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think like there's something to be said how both of them, to various degrees, like part of why they were able to kind of grow as characters is specifically, I think, if I remember correctly, like the understanding of a few of the characters. As you mentioned, like with Barkley, he like there was some like mean comments and that sort of thing. But for example, if I remember well, Troy was still nice, like so she's the counselor, and Picard, if I remember well. At the very least, with Data, I that the relationship between Data and Troy is for me something that's super interesting, and obviously because she's an empath, which is like an entire thing in Star Trek. Um, and so yeah, I mean, there's something to be said about that, I think.
Mhm.
But what do you think the value is? Or let me backtrack a bit. One of the things one of the main things I like about Star Trek is actually the fact that it's still imperfect. Like, they're 200, 300 years into the future, but there are still some issues. Granted, some of the issues that we're facing today seems to have been either resolved or mostly resolved, or at the very least not as big of a deal. Let's put it that way. But
Mhm.
there are other issues, and what I like about, especially when I watch them like chronologically, as in when they've been produced, not chronologically in the timeline, but when they've been produced, is that, and you have, obviously, I'm referring to the documentary that you put out on gender roles and gender stereotypes. So what I like about that, with the same example as like with the Jetsons, which is a bit random, but I because I mentioned this in a previous episode, like the Jetsons came out in 1962, and it was supposed to be like 100 years into the future, 2062. Like Joe Jetson was 40 in 2062, which means that he was born in our current year in 2022. And it's interesting for me to think about it that way. Like, and they were imagining what 40 years from today would look like 60 years ago, and they imagine, like, futuristic robots, whatever. But
Living in the
obviously,
clouds.
yeah, in the clouds and so. But like capitalism is still around, people still show up, and of course, gender roles are super like 19 as they pictured them back then, basically. And
Mhm.
I see that differences in between. There's already pretty significant difference between like like the original series and the Next Generation, and then obviously with Voyager, complete difference as well. Or at the very least, like it feels like it's shifting, and also like it's almost like the writers are consciously thinking about, I don't know, learning from the previous ones or what have you.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
can you talk a bit about that, like whether it's specifically on gender roles, but like on this notion that, well, it could be about the future, but it's produced at a certain period of time, which for us now is the past, and that in and of itself means that the future isn't the same, and which obviously opens up the possibility for us today in the present to imagine different futures because there's nothing written in stone.
Yeah, it's one of those cool things about Star Trek that I really like it as a franchise. Is because it is often a product of its time, but a product of its time that's trying to be better, but still rooted in it. If you go back to the original series, you see like women wearing short skirts, and there being like a romance of the week, and it being very male driven with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and
Mm-hmm.
also white people driven as well. Um, and so you like it's a show that like it has diversity in it, because you do have a black woman on the bridge, you do have a Asian man on the bridge, you do have a Russian at the time during the Cold War, but they are sort of background players rather than being really included in the story. So it's very tokenistic in a lot of ways. Like, hey, we have these characters here, and that was important, especially at the time. Like, that was seeing a black woman on the bridge who wasn't stigmatized in any way was amazing
Mm-hmm.
and very important. And I don't want to undersell that, but they were very just like background players. And that kind of leads us into like things like Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, where the people started to get more of a center seat, no pun intended, um, to like be more included in these stories. But then you'd encounter like other things too of their time, like LGBTQ issues. Or autism as well, like things that weren't really as understood, and so you'd see like the show try to do those things. Like Next Generation had and Deep Space Nine as well had like queer episodes, but they were very otherizing. They weren't really handled very well. They fell into a lot of traps of like the bury your gays tropes in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so and but also at the same time like still being very progressive, like even the queer episode of Next Generation, because it sort of coded an alien metaphor, accidentally comes around to being like a good prescient trans metaphor while still having problems in it, which is kind of funny because it was clearly not intended. Like they have a conversation about pronouns in the 1980s because it's like, oh, what pronouns do you use as an alien? So it's like problematic in the sense that like they don't see that humans could be that. It was like,
Yeah.
ooh, aliens are weird like that. um but it's I think it's a really it just creates this like weird enigma of this thing that like is problematic, but is trying its best to be progressive at times. And as a result, like, it's just an interesting discussion of like how people saw the future and how people were thinking about the future and the discussions that people had about the future at that time. And I think that that's really kind of, I don't know, it's just cool because it just enables us to have these cool conversations about it. And I've always said, like, Star Trek to me, I not always, but generally, I would say, like, for every single Star Trek show that exists, I think at the time there was a better or like much more like pushing the boundaries science fiction show on at the time. Like, Next Generation. Next Generation was probably the lead of its time, but like Deep Space Nine had Babylon 5, even though I think Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek show. Voyager was sort of up against a bunch of other things as well. Today we have a bunch of science fiction shows going up against like Star Trek shows today that I think are really great. The original series of things like the Twilight Zone and Outer Limits and things like that.
Yeah.
But the reason that I like Star Trek specifically is not just its ethos that it has, but also just because it is such a great litmus test of what the time was like. And I think that makes it really, really cool as just like a piece of media. And it's also something that has to like constantly address the past too, because it is something that's like, oh, we're going to make a show for the 24th century, but we're setting it in the Star Trek universe, then we're going to keep it canon with everything that came before. That you have to like sort of like deal with the fact that like, in the original series, they had a random episode where they mentioned like augmentation is not allowed in the future of humanity. That we sort of believe that like you shouldn't augment people, and that was just sort of a one-off story that they did. But then you get into Star Trek today, and there are still shows that are addressing that and using that as like a way to talk about stigma, like and sort of deconstructing like Strange New Worlds without spoiling too much. There's a character on it that is augmented and faces stigma by Starfleet because of that. Star Trek Prodigy is also getting into a storyline with that too. So it's really interesting because it's just like, oh, how do we sort of bring this forward in a way that like it honors the past but also addresses some of the problematic stuff with it.
No, for sure. I mean, I know the story of Nichelle Nichols herself, who unfortunately she passed away earlier this year. Well, it's on YouTube. Folks can look it up. Where she said that Martin Luther King himself, who was like a big Trekkie, apparently told her like not to, because she wanted to quit. Like she wanted to stop being Uhura and do something else. And I mean, according to her story, that he told her to kind of stay on, because of like what it represented and whatnot. But like it's a fascinating.
And one thing too about that story, randomly too, because it's always something that I think people leave out of that story that I think is important, because we sort of want to just be like, oh, it's like she didn't realize how important it was, and Martin Luther King came in and told her how important it was. But something that's always left out of that story, if you listen to Nichelle Nichols tell it, she was very angry at hearing that from Martin Luther King. And angry at hearing it from Gene Roddenberry, who said much the same as well. Because the reason she wanted to quit was because she was that background player, and because she didn't get to be front and center when she knew that she was good enough to be front and center, and she wanted to quit so she could go do more acting in like stage and theater and stuff. And she tells that story, and she talks about how like after Martin Luther King said that to her, she was very upset and angry at the world, because of what the place that it had put her in.
How limiting that was.
Yeah. And how she had to feel like the weight of the world upon her shoulders. And she's wonderful, and she did it, and it meant so much to so many. And she did so many great things, like inspiring many NASA astronauts and working with NASA to get many Black women into the program and into space. But I think it's also important to recognize that like the responsibility it forces marginalized people into as well, that I think sometimes gets forgotten in that story.
That's
so,
completely that's completely fair. Thanks for adding that. And actually, like it's a good bridge in some ways, because like representation isn't always well done. To put it mildly. You spoken in your video. I mean, again, the gender roles, the sexualization of women, especially in the earlier series. Like, can you talk more about that, and specifically because you have one video on that as well? Like, when it comes to trans representation, what did they do right? What did they do wrong? In your opinion?
I mean, when it comes to just gender, before we're even talking about trans, like Gender in Star Trek is fascinating because women were very included, but often very off to the side. Especially in, like, Next Generation, like, women were in the support roles.
Yeah.
You had the doctor, the
Yeah.
therapist. They had a couple characters that broke that mold, but they didn't stick around long because the actors felt like they weren't being written well for, because the writers didn't know what to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is telling that, like, the actors who kind of didn't fit gender stereotypes didn't stick around because they didn't feel like they were being
Yeah.
used. Um, and then and as the show went on, like, the male gaze of the series got more and more pronounced, especially in Star Trek Voyager, which creates this, like, weird tension,
Mm-hmm.
an interesting tension in Star Trek, because the characters were very well written. You had this character like Seven of Nine
Yeah.
who came into Star Trek Voyager, who's wearing, like, a sexy cat suit, and she's wearing like a underneath her suit. The actress Jerry Ryan talked about, like, how she had a lot of stuff underneath her to give her, like, this, like, thin waist and
Mm-hmm.
everything, and they often underlit her boobs and things like that. Like, she was very much there to, like, be the eye candy of the series. But she was written super well. In fact, some people would argue, myself included, that she is the best character on that
Yeah.
show. um and it just, like, it creates this interesting tension between, like, what the show was trying to do with its story and its focus in the future, but also, like, the very fact that it was made today, again, like I said, and the problems of the sexualization of today. And a lot of the problems that people point to, and I don't think it's limited to him, but I do think he was a big indicator of it, is Rick Berman, who is the man who took over Star Trek after Gene Roddenberry passed away, and ran it until the early 2000s. And he was a man who was very much like studio executive dude, and had the studio executive thinking, and wasn't really progressive, but was just sort of like, oh, let's just do this show. Like, he talks about how, like, he didn't really buy into Gene Roddenberry's vision, and Gene Roddenberry, very, very problematic man, but, like, he was very progressive in that sense, wanted to push the boundaries, whereas Rick Berman was just like, yeah, I'll just do it because that's what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't really try to push the boundaries, and as a result got tied into a lot of very problematic thinking, and treated women, especially, very badly, and otherized queer people, and denied queer representation in a lot of Star Trek a lot of the time. Or when he did do it, he felt it was like, oh, we're just going to do it just to do the issue on it. Like, we'll do the LGBTQ
Mm-hmm.
episode. We'll do it. It'll be fun. Get it out of the way so people will stop ranting about it. Um, and then also you could talk about, like, I won't get too deep into it, but, like, talk about how his mistreatment of women, specifically behind the scenes, was really awful as well. Though Gene Roddenberry is not alone. Rick Berman is not alone in that. Gene Roddenberry certainly had his own share.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, so there's that tension within Star Trek, in that, like, just the way it treated women was far from perfect. And I sort of exclude Deep Space Nine, because Deep Space Nine is much better about that, because it was the show that was sort of like the redheaded stepchild of Star Trek, and so it was, like, able to do cooler things. And so, like, it was able to, like, get away with more stuff, and it had much better representation overall. And there were still problems, like, again, Jessie Gender, the actress, Terry Farrell, was treated bad the way Rick Berman there as well, and they were still limited by some things, and still limited by some prejudices as well. So there's all of that. And then when it brings it to LGBTQ and transgender issues specifically, it has all of those problems where it's very otherizing in a lot of senses. Like I said, the Next Generation episode is like, hey, look at these non-binary aliens.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird? Isn't non-binary just a weird alien thing instead of a thing that human beings can be?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and going further, you had, like, Enterprise, which did, like, the HIV episode, but it was done in the early 2000s. Not to say that's not worth doing then, but, like, they had a script in the 80s to do an HIV episode during the height of the AIDS epidemic, and they didn't do it because it was because of homophobia. Like, the writer of that episode, David Gerald, literally stated that it was homophobia that kept it from being aired, and Rick Berman's homophobia specifically. But within that, because of the same thing that we are talking about with neurodiversity, because this is a show that had alien metaphor and had alien characters, you can still find representation in a way that even at the time we weren't getting. And I always point to the character of Jadzia Dax in Deep Space Nine, who is my favorite character in all of Star Trek, because she is someone that I got to see myself in as a trans person at a time where there was no trans representation. Because of what her character is in the show is due to this alien stuff. Her species, the Trill, one of the aspects of their society is that certain people in their society can get these sort of alien symbiotes put into them, and that gives them memories of past lives that the symbiote has been in. And so Jessie Dax is a character who has the past lives of numerous people, and her immediate prior life was that of being in a dude.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the characters on the show, including the captain of the show, remember her being that guy and treat her with the full awareness that that is part of who she was. Um, and and as a result, it kind of creates that trans metaphor of like, you used to be seen as a dude and now you're a woman, and there's no stigma attached to that. Like, the character who like first accept her fully, and like he makes a joke about it at first, but he's just like, yeah, this is cool, this is fine, whatever, and they treats her with full respect as anybody else, and even like jokingly calls her old man,
Mm-hmm.
which some people take as like, oh, he's misgendering her. If you like, in the show it's meant as like a term of affirmation, but like if you put a trans reading onto it, people will
Sure.
be like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
misgendering
Yeah.
her.
Yeah.
But I always love that too, even within a trans reading, because what it says is that he is allowed to say that to her, and she's okay with it, because it's him acknowledging the fullness of their relationship and not denying their relationship, and it's a term of affection and showing like, I see you and I can call you this because we know each other. Like, no one else gets to call you that. No one else calls him old man, or her old man, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
No one else calls her old man, because they're not allowed to, because they don't have that relationship. And I think that that's really, really cool. Um, and then you could even go into there's a character named Ezri Dax who sort of, without spoiling too much, gets the symbiote at some point in the series. Um, and Jadzia came into the series being like fully developed. Like, she was like a trans person who's been out for years, and like, I got this stuff. I know
Mm-hmm.
how to do this. I'm very confident in my identity. Whereas Ezri in the final season of Deep Space Nine, she's a character that like is figuring it out, and as a result, like, you can see her being a very, what we call in the trans community, a baby trans, just like still figuring it out. Like, she even says like at one point in the series, like, I don't know what pronouns to use. Like, there's literally a series like, I don't know what pronouns to use. I don't know if I'm a boy or a girl when I wake up in the morning sometimes. It's like, wow, I feel that very heavily. And so it's like about her like figuring out who she is in a transition moment. And I think a lot of like young trans people, or people who are trans people who are just coming out, relate to that a lot. Um, so like, those characters exist, and I think it does it really, really well in those contexts. And then there's like scenes too where like a Klingon, like, who is a friend of hers, like sees her, Jetsia sees her, and she's like, oh, Curzon, my old friend, which is her older name. And she says, oh, it's Jetsia now. It's like, oh, Jetsia, my old friend.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a perfect way to handle dead names. And from then on, they never use her dead name.
Mm-hmm.
It's great. Um, Flash forward to today, though, what I really love about Star Trek, and again, going to Star Trek Discovery specifically, but like, I think all of the Star Trek shows do this really, really well. It makes me very happy. But Discovery specifically has been very inclusive of literal queer people and trans people. Like, that show has 6 queer characters, including a transgender character and a non-binary character, trans man and a non-binary character, and they are allowed to be literally trans and non-binary. They aren't like coded as such, like they are expressly trans and non-binary. And as I talked about before, like, naturally allowed to be themselves. So like, a trans character will mention like, oh, I transitioned. Like, they just mention it casually as like an offhand line. It's not focused on, it's not like this big thing that like other TV shows would be like, they transitioned or they have to hide that fact. It's like, no, it's just a part of their lives that exists. That they can just refer to because it was part of their experience. And I love that. It feels natural. And I really love Discovery for that. But they also, what I love about Discovery too, is it understands the history too that it's representing. Talking about that stuff too. So one of the characters is a Trill. Like, they are trans, but they are also a Trill character. And I think and they use some of the Trill metaphor in that show to sort of talk about like just some like certain like feelings that trans people may have in the future about like surgeries and bodies and things like that, but not stigmatizing it in transness. So it allows the show to like recognize the importance of trills to many trans people, the character Jetsia Dax, while still being literalizing the representation. And then just to wrap out, like, other Star Trek shows, even while Discovery is the most diverse and has that more front and center, like Strange New Worlds had a trans character on it. There's queer characters in every single Star Trek show on right now. So I think it like, modern Star Trek shows have problems, certainly their own problems that are associated with today, that I'm sure we'll get more and more able to articulate as time goes on and we look back. But I also think that it does a great job in pulling that forward just for Star Trek.
Yeah, and again, it doesn't it like it highlights the importance of just having these characters. And yes, this is the thing about them. Sure, they are that, they're this, they're whatnot, but ultimately they're just characters in a story, and maybe their identity is relevant in one way or another. For like in a specific episode or specific plot, but ultimately they're just there as members of a crew, and they're valued as such. And that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
that's the value in it. Like they embody this complexity, and that complexity is not just accepted but like cherished. It enriches
Mm-hmm.
the other folks in that crew. And obviously for someone who's autistic, I don't think I've mentioned that specific thing, but for me, Data was one. So as I said, I knew a bit about TNG and TOI, like the original series, before really getting into them, like a couple of years ago. So I knew about Data, and it's something that I understood kind of retrospectively, like why did I have this attachment. And it's only later on when I kind of got diagnosed and I understood I was autistic, that it kind of clicked. It was those things. Oh well, this is why. And then when I rewatched, or in many cases watched for the first time, the Next Generation in 2020, I had an experience I feel like I can't quite describe, like as being something I felt with like other shows. Really, like it's something very specific.
Mm.
Very, it's not even like just fandom. I mean, not that fandom is a bad thing, but it's not just that. It was something like almost spiritual. It was something really really deep in that
Mm.
sense. I remember there was one. I won't mention too much again for the spoilers, but you know which one I'm talking about. Where like Data's humanness, let's put it that way, or personhood maybe, was kind of being questioned, and one of the other
Mm.
characters was defending it. And like for me, that episode was super moving. Like I think I was crying when I watched it.
It's that's my favorite episode of Next Generation by
Exactly, yeah,
far.
yeah.
Yeah, I know.
It's
Yeah.
just like I think it's called The Measure of a Man or something. I forgot the name of the, yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, you nailed
Okay,
it.
perfect. But like yeah, so that episode is something that kind of, yeah, I just love that episode, I guess. But besides that, if it's not too cheeky of me, like which ones are your if someone's listening to this, they don't know most of Star Trek, they followed our
Mm-hmm.
conversation because we did our best not to be spoilery,
Because we kick butt and we're
and we're
awesome and we
awesome
do
and
drink
so on.
chocolate.
Yes,
Yeah.
all of the above. How would you recommend that they start watching Star Trek?
So I actually did a whole video on
Oh,
this,
you did, yeah.
that you
Okay.
can check out. Yeah, which you should check out. But and what and I would recommend that video because I not just to my own go watch my stuff, but also because I go through every single series and like explain every single one and what's unique about it, what's good about it, what might be off putting about it to you if you dislike these certain things. So I think it's a good sampler. And I think you can really start with any Star Trek show, to be frank. I think Deep Space Nine, which is my favorite Star Trek show and I think the best one, um, is the probably the hardest because it's the most reliant on knowing a lot of the
Yeah, yeah.
universe, but you can still even start there and get it. So I think there's none of the Star Trek shows are too limiting in that sense. Um, but my recommendation always has been, if you are someone who can't really watch older shows, then I would start with the Star Trek movies, the ones with Chris Pine in it, and then go to like Discovery, and then maybe like Lower Decks, Prodigy. Picard is probably my least favorite Star Trek show, so you can take or leave that one in my opinion. But you can also check that out if you're a big fan of Next Generation because it's sort of a sequel to Next
Yeah.
Generation. But if you're I think you could just stay in modern Star Trek. Like Star Trek Strange New Worlds is also a great place to begin. So you can like pick those shows and really and just stay there. But if you're someone who can watch older stuff and be cool with it, then I would recommend starting with Next Generation. Begin and know that seasons 1 and 2 are a bit rough,
Mm-hmm.
especially season 1. But start with Next Generation, and then from there branch out, go to like Deep Space Nine, Voyager, maybe to go back to the original series and things like that. But I think Next Generation is a really strong starting place for most people. Um, you can start with the original series and watch it from then and go forward. But the original series is even more dated, I would say,
Definitely, yeah.
than some other shows, and it's still great. Like I still enjoy it, but you have to come in with the understanding that it's a very dated show.
Yeah, you have to be. That's why I was like, you have to be patient. I
Yes, yeah.
would, yeah, I would say the same thing. Like because I've seen, so as I said, TNG, DS9. Discovery, Voyager. Yeah, that's it so far. And now, while watching the original series, I'm able to kind of tolerate it more. Be more patient. Again, I'm using the same term because not just because of like funny special effects for us and stuff like that. That's actually I actually find that cute. It's yeah. Sometimes the dated stuff. I guess yeah, we just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
And with the more recent ones, because the special effects are much better, it's just easier to. I think for us as someone like I grew up in the 90s and 2000s, like it's just easier to kind of consume, if I can put it that way, than some of the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
But DS9 and Voyager, and I don't have a favorite one to be honest with you, but I love DS9 for its own reasons. Even the very weird stuff that happened at times, especially towards the end, I love all of that. And Voyager, I just got so attached to the crew in a way that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I did to the others as well, but like something special about Voyager for some reason, I got really, really attached to that crew. 7 of 9, definitely. I think
I
you're right.
agree.
Yeah,
Yeah, I love Seven.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
You should watch Star Trek. If you like Voyager, you should watch Star Trek Prodigy. You will deeply enjoy it
I'm
if you're a big
I'm gonna
Voyager
watch
fan.
everything. It's getting there.
Good, good.
But yeah, I mean, so the last thing I usually do on this, unless wait, first, like, is there anything you wanted to get into, but we didn't have time to get into it?
I mean, there's so much that I
Yeah,
wanted to
sure.
get into. We didn't get into it. Like that's why I have a YouTube channel where I talk
Yes.
about all of this stuff because I do have too much to
Fair
talk
enough.
about.
Yeah.
So, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So okay. With that in mind, usually I ask folks to kind of recommend 3 books.
Hmm.
One of the books that you recommend in that autism video, I have it with me. It's the whole
Yeah,
To
yeah,
Explore
yeah.
Strange New
It's a great
Worlds:
book.
Understanding Autism Through a Star Trek Lens by Elizabeth W. Barnes. It's a really, really interesting book. But what would you recommend? Like books or movie, whatever you want. What 3 things that you would recommend to our listeners?
Well, I'll recommend. So I'll start with a Star Trek book. One that I'm trying to think of like which ones I would recommend because I adore Star Trek books and there's so many out there. Um, Actually, I'll recommend one that I just read by Una McCormick. It was called oh God, let me look it up real quick. It's actually a Star Trek Picard novel, and I don't love Star Trek Picard as a series, but I love the books that come out about
Mm.
it. And I'm blanking on the name. The book is off the top of my head. So I'm just going to find it. Second Self. So there's a book called Star Trek Second Self, Star Trek Second Self, that just came out. And I think is one of the best science fiction novels that I've not only read in Star Trek, but one of the best science fiction novels that I've read this year. It is beautiful and fantastic. And it's about restorative justice, healing after like just being honest, it's talking about genocides.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really difficult book, but I think a really beautiful book and very beautifully told, and one of the best science fiction. It's a tie-in novel, but it's one of the best I've seen. Um, Other things to recommend, if I want to recommend, like I said, my favorite Star Trek show is Star Trek Lower Decks. I would highly recommend that show. I adore that show. It's like the comedy. If you like Rick and Morty
Mm-hmm.
or Solar Opposites and things like that, it's like a Star Trek version of that, but it's very earnest and very optimistic. Like it captures, like I think it's the Star Trek show that captures that earnest optimism of Star Trek more than any other, because it's so just beautifully, beautifully optimistic and earnest, and I love it. And so I really recommend Lower Decks. It's again my current favorite of the Star Trek shows. Um, and then just to pick something outside of Star Trek, I'll recommend just to go to another big science fiction franchise that's sort of encaptured my brain and my hyperfixation again now. Star Wars Andor.
Mm.
I think it was just a show that just came out, just finished its run a few weeks ago, and it is fantastic. I am shocked as someone who has not liked Disney Star Wars under Disney very much. Um, I am shocked by how good Star Wars Andor is. It feels very politically prescient, very like about today, very inspiring, and also just extremely well written and amazing characters. So if you're a Star Wars fan but kind of fell off because of Disney Star Wars, which I understand because I felt it too,
Mm-hmm.
Star Wars Andor I think is not only the best Star Wars thing that has come out in a long time, uh, but might be my show of the year. Like might be my favorite show this year, which again, shocking because I am someone who's not loved Disney Star Wars. So those would be my 3 recommendations.
Amazing, amazing. Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, so all that's left is just to thank you for doing this. This was super fun. And I, as you know, mentioned it obviously throughout this thing, but I highly recommend folks checking out your YouTube channel. It's honestly super fun, very interesting. very powerful, and yeah, all of the good adjectives that one can use.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was an honor to do this, and I really enjoyed being here. So I really appreciate you asking me to do this.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.